Good evening, everyone. I am Xavier Salomon. I am the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. But more importantly, I am a member of the board of Say Venice, and I'm on the projects committee of Say Venice. And it is a great pleasure for me to introduce this webinar tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to all the Say Venice members who are here tonight to join us for this webinar. And as you all know, Say Venice has been working on a huge number of projects in Venice over the last 50 years. And some of these projects, of course, have centered on the great painter of the Venetian 16th century, Titian. And Titian is going to be the artist at the center of the talk tonight. Most recently, Say Venice has worked and is working on two of Titian's greatest religious paintings, the Madonna di Ca' Pesaro in the Basilica of the Frari, which was completed a couple of years ago. And currently we are working on the great restoration project of the Assunta, the high altar of the Frari. But tonight we talk instead about a different aspect of Titian's art. We look at his secular work, at his mythological works, and we focus on a very important exhibition, which is currently in London at the National Gallery. It's an exhibition that opened earlier this year and unfortunately closed because of COVID. It then reopened and it has just closed again. But it's an exhibition that will travel, fortunately for all of us, to the Museo del Prado in Madrid and later next year to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston from the 12th of August of next year to the 2nd of January of 2022. So we will all have an opportunity then to see all of Titian's Poesie reunited. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Nathaniel Silver, a great colleague and old friend of mine. Nathaniel is the William and Leah Poorvu curator of the collection at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, where he is in charge of the collection, but also conservation and the archives. He was a fellow at the Frick many years ago. We slightly overlapped there, where he curated his first major show on Piero della Francesca in America in 2013. But then he moved to Boston to the Gardner, where he has curated a number of really wonderful exhibitions in the last few years since he's been there. Exhibitions on great Italian artists like Botticelli, Fra Angelico, and Raphael. But most recently, a very beautiful, moving, and important exhibition, Boston's Apollo, Thomas McKellar, and John Singer Sargent, an exhibition which only closed, I think, about a month or 2 months ago. Nathaniel has obviously been working recently in partnership with the National Gallery and the Museo del Prado and a number of other museums on this very important reunion of Titian's Poesie, and that is what he's going to be talking to us about tonight. Before I pass the word on to the podium on to Nathaniel, I would like to remind you all that at the end, for about 10-15 minutes, we can answer questions from the public. And so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to write questions during the talk, and we'll try and answer as many of them as possible. Please join me in welcoming Nathaniel Silver.
Wonderful. Xavier, thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction. I'm thrilled to be here with Say Venice tonight to talk to you about Titian's Poesie, and thrilled in particular because at the Gardner Museum, of course, we have what I would argue is the best old master painting in the United States, Titian's Rape of Europa, which forms a key part of this exhibition. Between 1551 and 1562, Titian painted for King Philip II of Spain a series of mythological paintings, a cycle, ultimately delivering to the king 6 paintings of mythological subjects over the course of that decade. Now, this was not just any cycle of secular subjects. This would become one of the defining works of art in the Western canon. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that it went on to influence artists and even the direction of the history of Western art for several centuries afterwards. To take just 2 examples, Rubens's art and the painting of Velázquez would not have ended up where they did without their access to Titian's works of art in the Spanish royal collections while they were both there. Now, this exhibition reunites these 6 paintings, today dispersed in collections in Europe and the United States for the first time in over 300 years. This is a project, as Xavier mentioned, that has been a major collaborative effort between the National Gallery in London, the National Galleries of Scotland in Edinburgh, the Museo del Prado in Madrid, and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Art Museum in Boston for the last 4 or 5 years. And it was no mean feat. Many of these paintings have never traveled before, including ours. And it was very exciting to finally see them all back together again in London in March when the exhibition opened there. Now, I show you here a shot of the interior of the exhibition in London. And of course, the reason it's empty is because, as many of you know, the exhibition closed 3 days after it opened due to the shutdowns forced by the global pandemic. It was a real tragedy. Happily, London was able to reopen this summer. And once again, however, they've been forced to shut, as of yesterday, shut their doors for over a month, again, because of the pandemic shutdowns. Now, the exhibition will, however, be moving on in the new year. And so if you haven't had the opportunity to see it in London because of all of the shutdowns, I highly encourage you to come to its final destination at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in August, opening August 12th of 2021 and closing on January 2nd of 2022. So you don't have to go anywhere. You'll have the opportunity to see it right here in Boston. Now, today I want to take this opportunity to explore the commission of the Poesie, of this incredible groundbreaking cycle of paintings, to talk a little bit about the 2 people who made it possible, about Titian and Philip, and then to look at each of the individual Poesie and to talk about them individually as paintings, ending with the Gardner's Rape of Europa. Now, the 2 men behind this remarkable project were, of course, Titian and Philip II. And I'm showing you here 2 Titian self-portrait and a portrait of Philip by Titian. Now, Philip, when he met Titian, was only 21 years old. He was really just starting out in his life. And yet it was going to be a life of portentous consequences for the rest of the world. And that's no exaggeration, because Philip would go on to lead what the world would discover was the first global empire. The Habsburgs and Philip would rule parts of Europe, of Africa, parts of the Americas, and of course the Far East as well. To take just one example, the Philippine Islands were named, in fact, for King Philip II, only a few years before he met Titian. Now, if Philip was starting out at the very beginning of his career, Titian was already at the peak of it. And you see him here as the grand old man of Venetian painting. At this time, when he first met Philip, he was already in his 60s. He was a legendary painter of international renown, based in Venice, but he had already become the non-resident court painter to aristocrats, to popes, and to other scions of Renaissance dynasties across Europe. To take but 2 examples, he was already very close to the Habsburg family. He had worked for Philip's aunt, Mary of Hungary, and of course, Philip's father as well, Charles V. This is who I'm showing you here in this magnificent and enormous equestrian, very grand equestrian portrait of Charles V, of Philip's father, in 1548. Now, the year 1548 was actually very important because it was in 1548 that Philip first met Titian in Milan. This was, again, Philip's 21 years old. He's on his first journey ever outside of Spain, visiting the different parts of the lands that his father ruled. And while in Milan, he has the opportunity to meet Titian for the first time. Now, at the end of this trip, 2 years later, it's in 1550 that Philip returns to Augsburg, and he summons Titian to join him there. And it's probably over the course of several months that the 2 of them hatch a plan for a series of paintings that Titian will create for Philip over the next decade or so. Now, it's also important to mention that those paintings are both of religious subjects and of mythological subjects. Philip was the great Catholic ruler. He commissions a whole number of altarpieces and devotional paintings, which also end up in the Spanish royal collections at the Prado and at the Escorial today, as well as the mythological paintings, which are the subject of my talk this evening. Over the course of the next decade, Titian delivers these paintings, these 6 mythological paintings. We don't actually know how many the two of them may have conceived together originally, but it was 6 canvases that he ultimately delivers. These stories that Titian depicted in the canvases were all inspired by Ovid. Ovid is the celebrated ancient Roman poet, and he was, at the time, the most widely read source of mythological stories in Europe. The most familiar source would have been very familiar to Philip, who owned a number of different translations of his work. And even though Titian's Latin was not very good, he too would have been very familiar with all of Ovid's stories, not least because he was friends with so many men of letters. You can think, for example, of Pietro Aretino. Titian calls his paintings in his letters to Philip, and many letters survive, the Poesie. Now, what does Poesie mean? The word effectively means the pictorial equivalence of poetry. Titian is laying claim to the creative power of poetry and challenging the written word with the painted image. So it's better not to think of these as illustrations of Ovid, but Titian's own interpretations of the creative potential of Ovid's stories. And as we look through them one by one, I want to think particularly about how Titian departs from the stories rather than how he includes a particular detail from it, how he makes it his own, and how he makes them stories that have a particular meaning to Philip. Now, these stories are stories of universal significance, that of relevance just as much today as they were in Philip's time. They're stories of love, of desire, of death. They're stories of lust and of cruelty and of hope as well. And they're stories that involve gods on one hand and mortals on the other side. The mortals are typically royalty, princes and princesses. So we might imagine that Philip could have identified with them. But on the other hand, as the leading ruler in Europe, he also identified with the gods. So we don't want to read too carefully into the particular princes and princesses and the way that Philip might have identified with them in these paintings. But it's also interesting to think of how he might have seen himself in relation to the paintings at different moments in his life when they're arriving, when they arrive, because they all arrive at different moments over the course of the next decade or so. Now, why Ovid? Well, as I mentioned, Ovid was the most familiar mythological source in Europe at that point, and mythological cycles were the prerogative of hereditary rulers. Titian already had an expertise in them. I can give you this example as one. These are 2 of the canvases from his celebrated cycle of the Furies. This was another Ovidian topic. So on the left, you see Sisyphus, and on the right, you see Titius. And this was also created for a ruler, in this case, Mary of Hungary, Philip's aunt, who was the regent of the Netherlands. So again, it reminds you that this relationship with Titian was a familial relationship, and that the idea for crafting a mythological cycle for Philip was one that Philip would have been familiar with already through Titian's other work for his family members. So let's start here with the first of the Poesie. This is the painting of Danai, today in the Wellington collection at Apsley House. Now, this was the first Poesie that Titian delivered to Philip in the year 1553. Now, according to Ovid, Danai was a princess whose father locked her in a tower after he received a prophecy that said that Danai would give birth to a child, and this child would kill him, would kill the king. So in order to protect himself, he locked his daughter in a tower. However, Danai was a very beautiful princess and was the object of the king of the gods, Jupiter's lust. And of course, no man-made construction could keep Jupiter away. He transformed himself into a cloud, which is what you see at the top of the canvas here, and penetrated the tower, coming to Danai as a shower of golden rain. He impregnated her, and ultimately she gave birth to a son, son Perseus, in fact, who will come upon later in this story. Now, what you see here, what Titian is showing us is the inside of this tower, is the bedchamber. Danai is lying naked on her bed. The sheets are rumpled, perhaps suggesting that she has already made love to Jupiter the night before. There are silk cloths on the end of the bed, and most notably, there's this old woman in the corner, a nursemaid a servant figure who seems to rush in, perhaps to catch some of these drops of golden rain falling from the sky in her dress. Now, this was already clearly a very sensual image. Danai is entirely naked, save for a piece of fabric over her knee. And this was a composition that was both familiar to Titian, because he had painted it several times before, and was a hallmark of his work on the female nude almost across Europe at this time. There were several versions of it. He had already made one for Cardinal Farnese, and that's the one that I'm showing you here on the right. He had, of course, made the Venus of Urbino, which was an equally sexy nude. And so I think it's pretty clear that in the very first Poesie that he delivers to Philip, he's relying on an existing formula of delivering for his patron this very young, very powerful man, a very sensual female nude for Philip's pleasure. And it's interesting to compare the two and to see what sort of changes Titian made in the painting that he sent to Philip from the composition that he had made for Cardinal Farnese. So, for example, you can see that for one, he's moved the veil on her right leg to the inside of her left leg. So instead of covering her, it actually invites the gaze in Philip's painting in between her legs. So it kind of reveals more than it conceals. Perhaps most significantly, he's transformed the Cupid figure in the Farnese painting into this figure of a servant, of a nursemaid in the canvas for Philip. And this old woman, however, far from being a figure who seeks to protect Danai, almost seems to be facilitating this encounter between Jupiter and the woman he's lusting after. So my point is that Titian has almost enhanced the sensual qualities of this picture, even more so than this already very sexy picture that he had created for Cardinal Farnese several years earlier. Now, one of the things that's very noticeable about Danai when you look at it with the rest of the cycle is that, of course, it's the wrong shape, right? All 5 of the other paintings are roughly square, and this one is long and rectangular. And so it says 2 things to us. Well, first of all, it clearly was cut down at some point in its history, and we know that for certain. But it's also a reminder that Titian made these canvases not for one physical space, because Philip's court was on the move at that time. There was no one physical space. But he built into them compositional similarities that could be compared when the paintings were together. And we'll look at some of those compositional similarities throughout this talk. Now, I just want to come back to the fact that Danai was cut down. And we know from a later copy, and this is the later copy, that one of the things that Titian originally painted into his Danai for Philip was the head of Jupiter. So the head of Jupiter coming out of the cloud, making it very explicit that this was the god himself. And then next to the head of Jupiter, the Habsburg eagle. And you can see that very prominently on this copy. This copy is just to show you both the original format of Philip's painting and the compositional elements, which we've now lost. So we have to imagine them and imagine that they would have existed in the original composition. Now, the second Poesie that Titian delivers to Philip is the composition of Venus and Adonis. Like the Danai, this is a composition that Titian is already closely familiar with, and he's done in several other versions. So again, he's relying on a tried and tested formula and reinventing it, making it anew for Philip. This painting is delivered to Philip in 1554. This is an important year for Philip. He delivers it later in the year, and it arrives with Philip in London. Philip's in London, of course, because he's getting married to Queen Mary, a woman many years older than him. And this is a dynastic alliance which Philip's father has created for the betterment of the empire and of the family, and which is also advantageous for England as well from Mary's point of view, because it will help her bring back Catholicism to England. Now, this is a painting of the mythological story of Venus and Adonis. According to Ovid, this is the story of Prince Adonis, who was the object of Venus's lust. So the love or the lust of an older woman. Now, Venus, according to the story, comes down from Olympus to hunt with the young Adonis. And that night, as they are making love, she warns him that not to go hunting the next day because something horrible might happen. He does not heed her advice. He wakes up in the morning, she leaves, he goes off hunting, and he's gored and killed by his wild boars. Now, Titian uses a strategy in this painting that's he really applies to the whole series. In the details, he both recalls past events and foreshadows the story that is to come in the future. So what he's focused here on in the middle is the moment in the morning when Adonis is leaving and Venus is trying to prevent him from going. But what you see just to the left of the Venus is the sleeping figure of Cupid. Now, according to Ovid, the reason that Venus fell in love with Adonis was because she had been pricked accidentally by her son's arrow. And if you look very carefully there in the background, Cupid is holding in his right hand his tiny arrow. So this is the kind of catalyst for this story. Now, on the other end of this, after Adonis goes off hunting and is mauled by the boar, Venus discovers this, hears his screams and discovers this, and comes in on her chariot from the heavens. And that's what you're seeing in the top right-hand corner, Venus in her chariot, discovering that her lover is dead. So this horrifying moment. Now, we have to imagine that this particular story might have had a resonance for Philip at this time. He was, of course, had just gotten married to a much older and actually more powerful woman. He was the consort of the Queen of England, so technically he had less power than she did at that point, much like Adonis's relationship to Venus. And also he's running off. And this is something that we know shortly after the wedding, Philip left England, and Mary, according to documents from the time, pined for him in somewhat the same way as perhaps we're seeing here with Venus and Adonis. Now, I mentioned that Titian doesn't simply illustrate Ovid's stories, but he really transforms them and makes them his own. And one of the things that's so unique about his depiction of the story as Venus and Adonis is that Ovid never says that Adonis leaves Venus. It's Venus who departs in the morning. Yet Titian decides to transform the story and to describe an imagined moment in which Adonis is leaving for the hunt and Venus is begging him to stay. So really kind of putting the focus on the desire of Venus for her younger, very beautiful man. Now, one of the other things that was very unique about this cycle is that Titian conceived these paintings, these 6 paintings, as pendant pairs. And here I'm showing you the first pendant pair of the set, the Danai and the Venus and Adonis. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that because there's quite a lot of correspondence surviving between Titian and Philip. And Titian writes to Philip and tells Philip that he wants Philip to compare certain elements, certain compositional elements of these 2 paintings. And I just want to quote you a passage from Titian's letter. He writes to Philip, quote, "I hope you will look upon this painting with the same delight that you have already reserved for the works of your servant Titian." He's always very obsequious, and understandably so, because Philip is pretty awful about paying him. Even by the end of the cycle, he hasn't paid him. So this is no surprise. He continues, "Since the Danai that I sent to your majesty was already seen from the front, in this other Poesie, I wanted to vary the composition and show the other side so that the chamber where they are to be placed will be more beautiful. So what Titian is telling Philip is that he wants Philip to appreciate the artist's mastery of the female nude. In one, he's shown a remarkable female nude from the front, and in the Venus and Adonis, he's shown another remarkable female nude, in this case from behind. So he's really calling attention to his powers as an incredible creator, as a painter, as an inventor of new compositions. And this signals to the viewer to look for formal compositions, formal relationships, not just in these two paintings, but throughout in each of the pairs within the series. Titian actually goes on in the same letter to anticipate the next pair. And he writes to Philip in that same letter, he says, quote, "I will soon send you the Poesie of Perseus and Andromeda, which will present a different point of view even from these." And so this is the third Poesie. And you can see how the female nude is again in a different position, in the standing position, turned away. This is the third Poesie delivered in 1556. By this time, Philip has left London. He's left Queen Mary behind in London. He's in Ghent with his court, and that is where Titian's painting finds him, Perseus and Andromeda. Now, it's worth mentioning that Titian originally conceived the second pendant pair as Perseus and Andromeda and Jason and Medea, two stories from Ovid. At some point, and for what reason we don't know, he abandoned the Jason and Medea part of the pendant pair and ultimately substituted the Rape of Europa, the very last painting. So we don't know why that is, but it's clear that he had the Perseus painting in mind when he painted Andromeda, because as you'll see at the end, again, there are these very notable compositional similarities that clearly were intended from the outset. Now, according to Ovid, Andromeda was offered as a sacrifice by her family. Her mother had claimed that she and her daughter were more beautiful than Neptune's Nereids, and so to punish her for her hubris, they had to sacrifice Andromeda, princess of Ethiopia, to the Gorgons, to the sea monster. Now, Perseus, flying by at this time, sees what's happened, but before he goes in to rescue her, he heads to her parents and he makes a deal. He says, "I will only rescue your daughter if you agree to give me her hand in marriage." They agree, of course. He goes off to rescue her. He kills the Gorgon. He rescues Andromeda, brings her back, and they get married. So this is the story effectively is not just a heroic salvation of a beautiful woman, beautiful and powerful woman. She was a princess, but it is effectively the story of an arranged marriage. And that must have also had a particular resonance with Philip at the time, for of course he too, his marriage had been recently arranged by his father to Queen Mary. So that's perhaps one of the things he might have thought about at this time as well, and something that would have made it a very appropriate choice of subject. Now, it's worth noting also that unlike the first two paintings, Danai and Venus and Adonis, where Titian was relying on existing compositions, this is the first time in the series that Titian has to create and invent something completely new. In this case, he's approaching a subject he's never treated before, Perseus and Andromeda, and he's creating an entirely new composition, making it all his own. And you can see that he struggled with that when you look at the technical evidence that survives, so the infrared images and the X-ray images, and we know from them that he made many changes, more so than any of the other paintings in the series. And just to illustrate how dramatic those changes are, I can tell you, for instance, that Andromeda was originally on the opposite side of the painting, so not on the left side, but on the right side. That's a pretty huge change because, of course, it would have shifted the entire focus of this composition. Perseus's legs were also similarly rearranged, his torso as well. So there were major and significant changes that Titian worked through on the canvas before he arrived at this final image, which he delivered to Philip. Now, despite having clearly faced some compositional challenges, Titian certainly didn't leave out the details, and he's very careful about this in all of his paintings. All of the paintings are in which you find these beautiful details, and the details are deeply meaningful to the story. So for example, in this case, I'm showing you here a detail of Andromeda's foot with some of the detritus of the ocean around her. So there's a seashell and there's some coral. And that's actually very significant because according to Ovid, after Perseus rescued Andromeda and set her down on the beach, he also set down on that same beach the head of Medusa, which he was carrying with him because he had already slayed Medusa. Now, we all know that Medusa's gaze turns living things to stone, and when he set it down on the seaweed on the beach, it turned the seaweed, the living seaweed, into coral. So again, this detail, this wonderful detail of the kind of rust red coral is a way that Titian is foreshadowing the happy ending of this story, the moment, even though he's not showing it, he's hinting to the knowledgeable viewer like Philip that this will all culminate in a happy ending for Perseus and Andromeda. Now I'd like to move on to the next pair, Diana and Actaeon. This is Diana and Actaeon, and its pendant, Diana and Callisto, were in fact delivered at the same time, both in 1559. And one of the things that's interesting about that is it means that Titian had both of them in his studio at the same time that he was conceiving and creating them, which meant that all of those compositional relationships in the pendant pairs that I mentioned earlier could be organically built into them rather than having to remember or look to an existing copy of a painting that he had already sent to Philip. Now, this painting is delivered, as I mentioned, in 1559, and by this point, Philip has returned to Spain and he is in Toledo. According to Ovid, the hunter Actaeon, the herdsman Actaeon, stumbles into the forest and discovers himself in a cool grotto as he's seeking shade. And as he looks around him, to his surprise, there are all of these nymphs, these naked nymphs, and he's discovered himself in this cool grotto, but it's the grotto of Diana. Now, Ovid's very specific about this grotto, and I'll quote a passage from Ovid's story. He says, it was, quote, a woodland cave which no hand of man had wrought. Titian, instead of trying to describe what Ovid does, transforms the scene by his own hand into something completely man-made, delivering a statement about what his art can do in recreating a man-made artistry and the power of his art over nature. So what does he do? He conceives of a sort of contemporary 16th century ruin. You see in the background, there's a rusticated arch with some incredible vaulting filled with these golden mosaics. And then if you look in the foreground, you see several of the nymphs are actually seated on a very elaborate fountain that would not be out of place in a Renaissance piazza. So again, this is one way of sort of updating the story for a contemporary audience and also showcasing the power of his own invention. Now, at the core of the story is this accident, this moment at which Actaeon stumbles upon Diana and her nymphs. And Diana is at the far right there with this sheet over her. Now, Diana, of course, is the goddess of chastity, and no mortal is ever meant to see her naked. And so he's committed quite a sin. He's made a big mistake. And you can tell that she's angry by looking at her face. And you can tell that Actaeon realizes that he's done something pretty awful that he wishes he could undo. Because if you look very carefully, at first glance, you might think that he's actually pushing away the red curtain, unveiling this scene. But I think if you look carefully, what you realize is that he's putting his hands up in front of him as if to undo, as if to wish that he could unsee what he's just seen, because he knows that there is now some pretty horrible punishment coming for him. And of course there is. Diana splashes him with water, according to the story. He's transformed into a stag, and he's hunted down by his own hounds and torn apart. So you see one of the hounds just at his leg to the back. And this is the fate that will soon befall him. So he's seen what is about to happen, and what's about to happen is not very good. Now, you get a little bit of a taste of that if you look where he himself is looking. If you follow Actaeon's gaze, you'll land right here. He's looking at the stag's skull. And again, this is Titian's way of foreshadowing the gory and graphic ending of this story. Something else that I also love about this detail, though, is that Titian, it's Diana who's angry. And if you look at these nymphs, they're clearly not trying to cover up. They see Actaeon's beauty. They see this handsome young man, and they're far more curious than they are angry or surprised. So again, this is another kind of departure from Ovid's story, and one which, one which Titian is adding to it and gives the story a particularly human feel. Now, there's one figure I just want to mention before we move on, and that's the Black woman sitting next to Diana. Now, this woman has been the subject of a lot of scholarship, and most recently a wonderful lecture given by Patricia Simons, in which she argued that most people, most scholars imagine this woman as a slave or Diana's servant. So it is a lower status than any of the other female figures in the paintings. But she points out that this is largely to do with our preconceptions about race, informed by the transatlantic slave trade, than anything that would have been relevant in Titian's own time, because in his time, color did not necessarily denote slavery, since many slaves were in fact white. And I think it's actually a very interesting argument, because this figure is given quite a lot of status. She's the closest to Diana. She is wearing jewelry in her hair, so you see some of her hair is done. She's wearing an earring in her ear, and she's also got on this fabulous dress. Now, far from singling her out from the rest of the nymphs, I think if you look carefully, you realize that one of the other nymphs right next to her was in fact wearing the same thing, but she's disrobed. So this nymph to the left of Diana has only a piece of it left in her hair. She's shed the rest of her garment. And I think if you accept that both of these female figures were wearing the same clothing, then there's no reason to think why the Black woman was of a lower status than any of the other nymphs there. But to imagine that at least these two figures and perhaps the rest of the nymphs were wearing similar kinds of clothing. Moving on to the pendant of Diana and Actaeon, I want to talk for a moment about Diane and Callisto. This was the 5th Poesie, so delivered, as I mentioned, again with the Diana and Actaeon in 1559. And this is just a reminder that towards the end of the series, the paintings for Philip get darker and darker. This is a really awful story. According to Ovid, Jupiter seduced one of Diana's nymphs, again, something you don't do, Diana as the goddess of chastity. The nymph Callisto becomes pregnant, but she has forced to conceal her pregnancy from the goddess because she knows that it will invoke her wrath. One day, bathing, she's forced to take off her clothes. And of course, as she does, her pregnant belly becomes visible. And that's exactly what you see of Callisto, who's the nymph lying by the side of the river, almost prone, with these 3 other nymphs around her. Her belly has just been revealed. Her pregnancy has been revealed. And Diana is absolutely furious. According to Ovid, she says, "You may not pollute this sacred fountain," and she casts her out. As I said, this is a particularly awful story. This is effectively the shaming of the victim of rape by her peers. And Titian really delivers it in the most kind of cruel and poignant way. If you look at the nymphs around Callisto, at first glance, you might think that perhaps they're trying to help her or conceal her from the wrath of the goddess. But in fact, they're doing quite the opposite. And you can tell immediately when you look at the expression on the nymph's face to the right. And then you see what she's doing. She's actually preventing Callisto's arm from pulling her dress back. The one above Callisto is holding her arm back, preventing her from keeping her clothes on, while the nymph at the left is actually tearing her dress off and revealing her pregnancy to Diana. So as I mentioned, this is a particularly graphic and particularly dark story. Now, as I was talking about earlier, Titian builds these compositional similarities into the pendant pairs. And I think perhaps in this pair, more than any of the others, it's on show. For example, look carefully at the foreground and you'll see how he connects the two compositions by the means of this river. Now, the river doesn't just run through the two paintings, but in each painting, it separates Diana from the other protagonists. So on the left from Actaeon, and it separates Diana from Callisto on the right. Again, these are the intruder figures, the figures who are not worthy of being within Diana's space. So it serves as a kind of metaphorical barrier as well. Another thing that's very noticeable when you look at both of these paintings together, other than the wonderful dog in the foreground of Callisto and the fantastic dog, one of Actaeon's hounds, are the fabrics. Titian is a master of depicting fabric, and he uses fabrics to bookend the two compositions. So on the left, there's this wonderful bright red silk curtain almost that one of the nymphs is pulling over herself, and Actaeon is almost trying to hide behind, realizing that he's seen something he shouldn't. And on the right, this canopy-like textile over Diana. Now they're symbolically significant as well. Red as perhaps a color of lust, but also a color of warning. And we'll see in Europa how he uses the color red for Europa to signal to her friends how the awful predicament she's found herself in. And then on the right, if you look very carefully at a detailed image of the fabric over Diana, you see that it's embroidered with unicorns. So these are the symbols of Diana, the symbol of chastity. And Diana is, of course, the goddess of chastity. So all of these elements both resonate with one another, but they're also deeply meaningful to the compositions and to the stories in both paintings. The final Poesie to be delivered is, of course, the Rape of Europa, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with now at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Now, this is the last painting delivered to Philip in 1562, and Titian is clearly particularly proud of it because he calls it the soggello, or the seal on the series. So we can imagine that as sort of the concluding flourish of this entire decade-long campaign of painting some of the most fabulous secular works that Titian has ever painted. Now, according to Ovid, again, Jupiter, the perpetrator, is lusting after the young princess Europa, and determined to have her, he sees her one day picking flowers in a field with her maidens. There's a herd of cows nearby, and he transforms himself into a bull, a very beautiful bull. Europa catches sight of this particularly beautiful creature and heads over to it, making her flowers into a wreath to put on its head. And in fact, you can see the wreath of flowers on the bull's head in this painting. The moment that she does that, Jupiter whips Europa onto his back and carries her off across the ocean to Crete, where he will rape her, and their progeny will become the founders of European civilization. So this is a story. This story is no less than the legendary foundation of Europe, one of the largest parts of the empire that Philip has now inherited. Now, again, Titian is showing the most dramatic, the most precarious moment, the moment when the bull has gone tearing off across the sea with Europa on his back. She's sliding off. She's waving this red cloth in her hand in alarm, crying out to her friends, and you can see the look of horror on her face. And in the background, you see her maidens on the shoreline. You see them waving back with pieces of fabric, and you see, of course, the herd of cows next to them, which Jupiter had insinuated himself among in order to get close to her. Now this, as I mentioned, was the final pendant pair, and you can see immediately the compositional resonances between the two paintings. So not least this wonderful red fabric that is billowing under Perseus's arm, Titian reuses in an inverted shape as the fabric that Europa waves over her shoulder. So here he's transformed it from a kind of herald of Andromeda's salvation into the signal of Europa's alarm and her impending demise. He also, for example, borrows the composition and the idea of a figure falling out of the sky for Europa, and he translates it into the figure of the Cupid. So he gives you this wonderfully foreshortened Cupid who's kind of echoing or perhaps even making fun slightly of the Perseus figures posed coming out of the sky as well. Now, with just a moment left before we take questions, I wanted to mention something important about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum painting. The Europa was the only painting to undergo conservation treatment before this exhibition opened. And some of you may have seen our conservator, Gianfranco Pocobene's wonderful lecture last fall. For those of you who haven't, I just wanted to mention quickly the two major parts of this campaign. The first was that we replaced the strainer on the back of this painting, so the support of the canvas that kept it taut. I should mention that what you're seeing here, this was not the original strainer. This was the strainer that was replaced when the painting was lined, probably in the 18th century, early 19th century. Our conservation team built a brand new strainer, a much more secure one, then tacked the canvas back down to it with these strips on the side to protect it so that it would be more secure for travel. That was the first part of the conservation campaign. The second part was, of course, the cleaning. We discovered from cleaning tests that this was a painting that would clearly benefit from a surface cleaning. The painting, after extensive technical analysis, was revealed to be in exceptional condition, with the exception of the dirt on the surface. And so we felt very confident in moving forward with this surface cleaning. And you can see a few of the cleaning tests here. Our hopes were, in fact, we were, in fact, happily surprised to discover that the painting looked absolutely beautiful beneath this layer of dirt and grime, a layer of dirt and grime which had built up over the course of, well, since the painting had arrived at the museum in 1896, because we know from our files that it had never been comprehensively cleaned. So this was quite a significant intervention in the history of this painting. And of course, it came out absolutely beautifully. You can see here the halfway mark on the piece of red fabric with these wonderful lead tin yellow highlights that now sing once again. Here's Gianfranco filling in a few of the very, very small areas of the surface that needed a tiny bit of retouching. And then you see here the final canvas. So I encourage you to come to the Gardner in August to visit Europa, reunited with her companions for the first time, and to enjoy this exhibition in 2021 that gives us something to look forward to, something for us all. So thank you so much for having me save Venice.
Well, thank you so much, Nathaniel. We're just so looking forward to seeing the exhibition. I would like to thank everyone for joining us again this evening. Thank you for all the viewers. Thank you to all the Save Venice members. Thank you for all your support. And I would like to encourage you all also to go on our website, Save Venice website, and see the very recently produced and beautifully filmed short sort of documentary film called A Love Letter to Venice, where a lot of what we're doing right now is shown in beautiful filming, and you'll hear a lot of voices from Venice. So thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to seeing everyone at the next Save Venice webinar. Good night.
Thank you, Xavier. I'll see you all at the exhibition. Good night.
Look forward to it. Good night.